Welcome to the Economist Impacts Global Trade Week 2022 panel on changing tariffs and tariff barriers. Are you prepared? My name is Alice Slayton Clark. I'm the Director of Investment, Trade, and China for the U.S. Council for International Business, a unique international advocacy organization representing 300 corporate members in international policy deliberations that impact companies doing business in the global marketplace. USCIB is a unique U.S. affiliate to business at OECD, the International Chamber of Commerce, and the International Organization of Employers. We also have non-governmental organization status at the United Nations and other international bodies, making us the voice of U.S. business across the multilateral system, where we develop solutions and influence global policies relating to trade, supply chains, labor, environment, and other issues. I'm pleased to moderate this important panel exploring the state of global trade and its impact on international business. As noted in the description of this program, global supply chains are under extensive strain today due to pandemics, war in Ukraine, the domestic trends towards onshoring and reshoring industries in the name of national security. The global trading order is in jeopardy as the World Trade Organization struggles to deliver on its three core mandates: negotiation, monitoring, and dispute settlement, and to deliver rules for the 21st century economy, including digital and trade and environment. Nations are increasingly using domestic remedies to address violations of agreed rules or to fill the void where rules don't exist. All of this is upending long-standing trade relationships, supply chains, as well as business models. Given this challenging environment, this panel today seeks to answer the question: what should business expect, and how can companies adapt to the changing face of global trade? To help us answer this question, I'm joined today by Myra Souza, Stakeholder Relations at Trade Experts, Daria Galperina, Head of International Trade at Pernod Ricard, Fernanda Herman, Head of Global Customs, Standards, and Strategy at Diageo, and Stuart Patterson, Research Fellow at the Henrik Foundation. So welcome, everyone. Let's get started. I think it might be best to set the scene on how we got to where we are today in global trade. So my first question goes to Stuart. Given the extensive thought I'm sure your foundation has put into this question, what have you found to be some of the main root causes of the recent trends towards deglobalization, onshoring, and unilateralism that we see in international trade today?
Well, thank you, Alice, and it's a pleasure to join this panel on such an important topic. I think if asked to assess what the root causes were, I think I'd argue that there are two. The rise of mercantilist economies and their growing importance in the world economy generally and in global trade in particular. And secondly, the sort of migration from a unipolar world to a multipolar world as China has accumulated large amounts of national power and therefore threatens American hegemony. So, I mean, if we were to elaborate a little bit on the first of those, clearly it's worth pointing out that the multilateral trading system as we've enjoyed it, perhaps through to 2008, is something of an anomaly in the big scheme of modern history and trade. And the rules of the trading system were not really put together to take account of the fact that the largest trading economy in the world would be a non-market economy pursuing mercantilist commercial policies. And so clearly the framework really in which we were operating was ill-suited to such an eventuality. And so what we've seen as a result, I think, has been this massive concentration of manufacturing power in China. China now enjoys a sort of near 30% global share in manufacturing value added. And something that has been achieved by being allowed to join the global trading system with an undervalued exchange rate, a fixed exchange rate, capital controls, a banking system that was effectively state-owned, and very heavy use of industrial policy and subsidy to its industrial sector. And inevitably, as that power grew, so the stresses in the global trading system were going to rise. I think the second point I'd make is that China is not alone in running perennial current account surpluses. Germany, the size of Germany's surpluses would make the Chinese blush, I think, quite often, and Germany's surpluses have been as perennial pretty much as China's have, certainly this century. So clearly the single European currency, I think, has been a factor in preventing the international adjustment mechanism from working. So I guess the question then is, as great power competition heats up, where does that leave us, and what can companies expect? And I think that the reality that we're facing is one in which the benign element of globalization and trade is now in the past. That increasingly international commercial policy is viewed through the prism of national power accumulation. And I think we will see an increasing politicization of all international commercial policy. Part of that might be driven by national security concerns, but there are other agendas out there as well, such as the ESG agenda, the green agenda, which mean that companies will find themselves increasingly operating, I think, in a bifurcated world in which the political considerations of their actions will be a real limiting factor, and resilience will come at a price in terms of efficiency, because there is clearly a tension between the two goals.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I wonder if any of the other panelists would like to chime in on this question. Any thoughts on how we've gotten to where we are today, or any reflections on what Stuart has just offered us? If not, we can move on to the next question. I realize that, as we've mentioned, COVID-19, the pandemic, has caused some trade to decline. And as GDP has fallen, countries have adopted more protectionist or unilateral trade and investment measures. But many unilateral initiatives were already in place before the pandemic. For example, the U.S. Section 301 tariff actions waged against China's intellectual property practices, and the U.S. Section 232 national security actions on steel and aluminum. But these are just a few examples of the unilateral barriers that companies have had to navigate in recent years, as Stuart has pointed out. Fernanda, this question goes to you. How have you seen the proliferation of these unilateral actions affecting business sourcing decisions? And what has been the impact on Diageo's ability to remain globally competitive?
Thank you, Alice. And it's actually a very interesting point when you say some of these initiatives impacting global trade had already been in place for a while. And I'm fully aligned here. So getting to your specific question, yes, all changes at global level are a big challenge for us, I believe, for any multinational company. And particularly when I bring this to our environment. So international trade is at the heart of Diageo's business, at the heart of our business. So I would say when it comes to impact arising from unilateral measures, it has been key for us to stay prepared and agile enough to adapt our ways of working. And this is actually, I would say, a culture that we live in our day-to-day business, or our day-to-day basis. Every Diageo employee has to be agile and efficient in terms of ways of working. So it's one of the points. And another aspect that I would say it's worth to cite here, also related to impact, is the risk management. So looking at these from a risk management perspective. And when we approach our business from an international trade perspective, all the impacts of trade measures, they are not only relevant to sourcing, but equally, if not more important, relevant on our route to consumers. And when I say a route to consumers, that's something that in our business, it must be effective. I mean, we need to have the right product in the right place at the right time to win with consumers. So what I want to stress here, or maybe emphasize with risk management aspect, is how important that is to address the impacts of trade measures to business. So again, an effective risk management process, it will support, or it does support in our environment conversations, supports to drive sourcing and supply decisions all the time. So it's really finding the balance of being effective to manage the risks arising from trade barriers, and I would say taking concrete and agile action. So the combination of these two supports the business to remain globally competitive and should be able to support any multinational company in the international trade environment. Yep. So maybe to close out the answer to your question, my view is that's definitely yes. The impact of all these measures, it can be, and it is representative to business, but the actual very active involvement to prevent escalation of these, let's say, escalation of these tariff tensions, combined with what I said, the agility to drive our changing ways of working and adapt the business and embed everyday efficiency in our work. So all of these together help us to support the business to emerge stronger and deal with the trade barriers that are coming more frequently.
That's very insightful. And I'm sure that Pernod Ricard, another leading spirits provider, has had similar experiences to Diageo. As you just explained, business bears the impacts and must demonstrate agility in adjusting their sourcing and business modeling and subsequent policy shifts that they're confronting in the international realm. What advice would you give to policymakers, Daria, to help industry adjust, minimize impacts, and weather the uncertainties of the current global trade environment?
Thank you, Alice, and I'm very glad to join this panel today. I would like to echo a few things that Fernanda already said. She really laid a good background for what I'm going to say next. Indeed, Pernod Ricard, we also an export-oriented company that exports to more than 160 countries around the world, and the majority of our products are still connected to its origin. So champagne and cognac are produced in France. Irish whiskey is produced in Ireland. Scotch whiskey is produced in Scotland. So for our company, as well as for Diageo, and overall wines and spirits sector, the ability to flow goods freely is critical, be it in normal times or in times of crisis. So indeed, as Fernanda said, the word agility is a key for our economic competitiveness and resilience. When it comes to supply chain, we actually don't make a choice between onshoring or diversification. We need a political and a legal framework that supports both in order to make the decision that is the best for the business. So, and indeed, international trade. 99% of Swedish vodka Absolut is exported. 98% of cognac produced in the region is exported. So there is three elements that are important for us in international trade. It's WTO, it's diversification, and it's regulatory cooperation. So I would briefly stop on each of those. So the backbone of predictable, stable, and rules-based international trade is the WTO. And one never thinks at the cost where WTO not to exist. So even if with all criticism around the WTO these days, it remains extremely relevant institution for us for doing business, but also for the business planning in the long term. So, for example, we boosted our presence in China or in Kazakhstan following their accession to the WTO. We use WTO on an everyday basis to address market access barriers, tax discriminations, technical barriers to trade. So all this is a very important added value to us. And that's why we do urge decision makers to dedicate time and political will to the reform of the institution. So that's the first point. Secondly, we need policymakers to recognize that trade diversification and trade agreements are an important element of resilience strategy. And that we need to make sure that governments unlock economically significant markets. Western countries are often dreaming about reshoring, and that's one of the reasons why, one of the excuses for deprioritizing FTAs. The reality is that this will not happen overnight. And I really doubt that Western countries and Western populations actually will want to pay significantly more for certain items currently sourced in emerging countries. And similarly, Western countries never think about losing export jobs to export destinations. So if FTAs or the WTO liberalization efforts fail, companies who serve export markets will have a higher incentive to move export related manufacturing overseas. So that's the second point. And the third point is about the regulatory cooperation. In the areas of common interest, be it in environment or international standards, unilateral initiatives to regulate matters of common interest could lead to the fragmentation of trade and regulatory frameworks, misunderstandings, to possible retaliations, increased costs for legitimate business. Any of those doesn't look to me as a very satisfactory result. So I stop here.
Thank you for that. That is a great segue into our next question as we transition toward the chemical industry. For them, there are additional challenges to trade and supply chains due to regulatory fragmentation, as you mentioned, between countries. Chemical producers have long promoted more cooperation between trading partners to harmonize standards and regulations at a high level to promote human health, safety, and the environment. Myra, how does the rise of unilateralism and the challenges of the multilateral trading system impact the chemical industry's supply chains and global business strategies?
Thank you, Alice. It's a pleasure as well to be here with you today and with my distinguished panelists. And I think that indeed made a great link, so thank you, about the regulatory cooperation. So what we see is indeed, in my views, like a storm of different measures coming from everywhere. That we have to keep at all times vigilant and really trying to understand everything, what they mean, being unilateral, extraterritorial, and coming from different jurisdictions, all at the same time. And then I'll just give you an example of some of them and then how I see the role of WTO in relation to that. So I can mention a few ones that some of you for sure have heard about the carbon board adjustment mechanism, for example, that the EU has started. We see there might lead some complications in terms of how this is going to be calculated, how it's going to be definitely implemented, if it's going to be WTO compatible or not. And what if other than jurisdictions, they are also talking about implementing their own schemes? How does this all gonna, converge? I think it's going to be really complicated for the business in between that. A second one that I'm also dealing on a daily basis, the corporate due diligence. So I have seen a study actually, that out of 25 countries, 11 countries have already started or in the progress of implementing due diligence as well. And again, they all have like one goal, as Daria mentioned, environmental, human rights, and so on. But they don't have a common approach. And then what we see already is like also some divergence, how they are being implemented, or even if they mention that they have some international standards or guidance. So we have the OECD, United Nations, guidelines for business and human rights, or then some ILO, some of the provisions of the International Labour Organization that they have in mind when designing that. I still have my doubts, and I'll talk about this when this is really implemented by then. Anyway, and then still on top of that, there is another one that I'm very interested in the past days, which is the digital product passport. This is going to be a huge impact on the manufacturing industry. And if I take an example again of the EU, so it's a proposal that has been adopted now a few weeks ago. What it means, we already know this barcode in products, right? It's not something new. But what's going to be new is that it will become mandatory to any physical goods that will be replaced in the EU market, for example. And there are only few exceptions. And this is not only the EU. So now I hear there are international organizations, at least 3, 4 of them, for example, working to develop international standards to fit the purpose of this digital product passport. And I hope that they're talking to each other, and I hope that these different standards, they will maybe look like, let's hope for that. And then the objective of this proposal is really great. It's really to boost circularity, really shorten the life cycle environment impact of products, and so on. And anyway, when looking in general, with all these measures they might trigger, of course, investment to adjust manufacturing, supply chain, costs of implementation, maintenance, some indirect or direct impact on SMEs, how they're going to cope with that, impact on least developing countries or developing countries, market distortion, for example, or diversion that can happen as well. And at the end of the day, I think one of my colleagues already mentioned, the cost will be passed to customers, definitely. And then for me, the big question on top of this, the whole thing, is like enforcement. We are having great measures out there, but do we have the infrastructure needed for enforcement? What I have seen at least is that no. If I just take the chemical industry, there was a report last year about REACH, CLP. This is a really heavy legislation on the chemical industry. And then it was really about enforcement and linking to the e-commerce. And then, I mean, a high percentage of non-compliance of imported products coming to the EU that they don't comply. So for me, at the end, what is the impact as well is in the domestic industry. Here we have to comply with that, but then we have third country operators placing goods into the EU. They're just taking the risk. And then we start also wondering ourselves, we have a compliance cost to implement all these different measures in place, and then you have the risk. And then some operators, they may just decide to take the risk because also in terms of penalties is not aligned, is not uniform, and they may just decide to take the chance as we have seen it. But then, even as I mentioned, we talk about international standards, we may have some guidelines and so on. What we have seen, again, the chemical industry was with the guidance, which is non-binding, for the United Nations global system system that we have on the chemicals, classifications, and packaging, right? However, the way the countries they have implemented those, they really differ. They implement in their own way. And the greatest example that we have about this is the EU and US. And you have seen this like one of the biggest challenges during the TTIP renegotiations, for example. So even though you have some international guidance out there, it doesn't mean that governments will implement their way, the same way. And then, my point to the WTO is, as Daria also mentioned, we have, for example, the Trade Barriers to Trade Committee, where it's definitely a key forum where it can support this global convergence of regulations at the international level, and try to have the dialogue to avoid all these protectionist measures and then consequently the retaliation. So I think keeping the WTO is key, definitely. The forum, the rule books, because otherwise, as we have seen, even with that, the governments are going their own way, definitely. And then as some of my colleagues in the area say, trade without WTO will become a jungle to the detriment of the different members and then the business. So definitely, as business as well, I really think that we need to put some pressure and for the political will, I think as mentioned by Daria as well, to revitalize the WTO reform. Thank you, Alice. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Myra. This leads into my next question, which speaks to this fragmentation in our global trading alliances. But, with the COVID pandemic, the conflict in Ukraine, and geostrategic tensions between the US and China, it seems to be fueling a trend toward a decoupling of nations considered to be at higher risk and unreliable trading partners. clearly this is going to create problems for your supply chains. So I throw the two questions out to the panel. How is this trend, and is this trend already impacting your supply chains? And how are you adjusting your business strategies longer term, particularly with respect to China? I thought maybe we could start with Daria, if you're willing to take the lead, and then maybe lead to Fernanda and Myra with your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alice. So China is our second largest market. It's the second largest market for Pernod Ricard. The import tariffs are between 5 and 10%, so they're very decent. And actually, the regulatory environment in China is more favorable than in some of its neighboring countries. There are obviously areas where we would like to see more alignment between China and Western countries, maybe on international standards. But here I would like to come back to the issue of the regulatory cooperation, which is extremely important. So it's something that needs to continue. And actually, I'm speaking here on the example. We had recently an issue in China, which could have been resulted in a quite significant market access barrier. But thanks to the regulatory cooperation and thanks to the dialogue between European Union and China particularly, it actually didn't happen. It didn't realize in life. So I would also like to say that when we speak about China, it is important that the positive experiences in doing business in China are also reflected in China's strategies.
Fernanda, would you like to respond?
So yeah, I was just saying that I'll maybe start addressing the last part of your question and coming from the answer about prioritizing strategies and bringing this more from a business practical approach. So really addressing, of course, China is a big market, and I think Daria pointed correctly. There is still a lot of regulatory alignments required, but from a business perspective, I think it's really looking into the business model and bringing a bit of both the global and the local trade partners to the table. So try to address that from this perspective. And when I say it, it's considering what we say internally, all the what if scenarios, because China is the one market now, but who knows what comes next. So it's really bringing together. I'll start maybe bringing or putting some few into the digital conversation about all of these. But it's the digital transformation. So bringing data analytics, automation, everything that can help us accelerate the pace and address the impacts coming from these. I could bring some practical examples for industries, for example, also aligned to that, about when innovating products, so using tariff re-engineering to innovate products, and that with a specific eye on changing tariff and changing trade environment. So a bit of the operational flexibility to be able to respond to all these policy shifts and trends.
Great, thank you for that. Myra, do you have anything to add?
I probably would just add quickly, but has been already mentioned, like a lot of companies, there is the way they do the business strategy, they optimize like the plants globally. So it doesn't, what it means in fact is like the same product will not be produced everywhere. Right, so either it's going to be produced in China, in the US, and so on. And then what we do is like regions transfers and so on to supply the global demand of a specific customer in next place and so on. So I do agree that this shift is not going to happen from one day to another. If this manufacturing site is in China, for example, it really requires investment, capital and so on. There are really lengthy times required for specs. The specification approval and so on as well. And then difference in quality and cost and so on of these raw materials. So all of this is really takes time. And I also agree they may not be reshoring home. They may even just leave in China because they're going to another country nearby, being, for example, Vietnam or South Korea and so on. And even though if there are some companies leaving China, they were already doing this before. because of the rising costs in China anyway. And this is a dynamic that is not new to us. So back to you. Thank you.
That's great. I thought we could move into, I know you've addressed a few of the facilitation suggestions to help you overcome these hurdles, which would be my next question. I wonder if you could also maybe add, if you have a few more thoughts on what can policymakers do to facilitate trade for your companies, not only in the regulatory environment, but elsewhere. And can you see the current multilateral trading system able to deliver on this? Or are you seeing enough fragmentation today that it may not be achievable at the multilateral level? Anybody like to start with that question? Stuart, do you have any thoughts on that? Or would like to chime in on some of the other questions?
I'd sort of circle back to, since I don't run a company, I'd circle back to the China-Ukraine issue and the earlier comments. Because I do, while accepting that obviously some companies have had a terribly successful outcome in terms of selling into China, I think that one of the lessons that is coming out of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is to be drawn is the amount of money that multinationals are being forced to leave on the table in Russia. And we're heading, I think, into an environment in which companies need to plan for that eventuality occurring in China as well. And so part of the resilience at the corporate level and the risk reduction at the corporate level, I think, has to be aimed at avoiding an over concentration of market power in China. And my sense is that capital markets are already beginning to reward companies that are diversified away from China and penalize those that are overly dependent upon it. And you'll see that as jurisdictional risk rises, so the cost of capital of doing business in the sort of arc of authoritarianism is rising. And I think that's probably the long-lasting consequence of what we've seen out of Russia, Ukraine. And I think that's something that at the corporate strategy level, companies have to be increasingly aware of. And of course, a lot of this is being driven not by policymakers at all, but it's by the perceptions companies have of their own brand in the various countries. So you have the likes of H&M or what have you, who have run into huge political problems and very damaging to their China business by upholding the values that the company have purported to hold in their domestic markets. And these are antithetical to each other. And so companies are increasingly being forced to choose. So, I'd be interested, for example, in Pernod Ricard's sort of approach to that. You have your second largest market, you were saying, and a fairly successful outcomes from trade there. But at what juncture and what sort of planning is being undertaken generally for a great bifurcation in which that's is no longer tolerated?
Would you like to address that, Fernanda?
I think you brought in your question, I'm making some of the Steve words, but you brought in your question, Alice. So on the facilitators that help companies to overcome these trends in deglobalization. And I really like, I'm a big fan of the word facilitator or facilitation. And again, I bring it back. I think there is a number of items here to help business, or a number of facilitators that we can consider. Oftentimes, I think the first one actually that comes to my mind, I'll bring back, it's about trade analytics and technology. I've seen this more and more being used to quickly help us review our trade flows, analyze trade data, and that all will support us with the scenario planning. So it's really the ability to support our business, meet quickly sourcing decisions, road to market decisions, and be prevented to situations like that.
Would any others like to chime in here, or should any thoughts? Additional thoughts?
Yeah, maybe just to respond to Stuart as well. Look, trade facilitation and trade diversification are really two very important elements of the resilience strategy. And that came obvious already during COVID time. So, over reliance on any country in this world is problematic, because during COVID time, when health measures were introduced, which were pretty unpredictable, so we never knew what will happen next day. So that's started from there, and I think that's why we're saying that we are not looking at the trade facilitation anymore just something that helps to save the costs, or trade diversification as something that will increase our presence in the given market. It's really the part of the resilience strategy, which also has to be taken into account equally by policymakers, and not only focusing on few elements, for example, onshoring or some other kind of more defensive policy instruments. So both are important, offensive and defensive agenda.
If there are no other thoughts on that, I'd like to just throw one last question out just to sort of tie this together and close the session today. I would love your thoughts on where you see the global trade system headed. I think you've kind of alluded to it in your earlier answers. Are we entering a long period of deglobalization? Do you think nations are shifting trade alignments along national security lines, perhaps devolving into some sort of iron economic curtain? Or is multilateralism only in short-term hiatus as we weather the current crises? I welcome your thoughts on this. Maybe we could do a lightning round and get some thoughts. Stuart would probably be the first to kick this off. Go ahead, Stuart.
Well, I mean, you can have a bifurcation of the global economy and a sort of re-globalization along different lines, rectifying some of the errors that were made 20 years ago. And I think what you're seeing in trade pacts like CPTPP, are like-minded nations that want to trade together, that want to facilitate trade and maximize the economic welfare that comes from that, getting together in order to push a trade agenda that is fit for the next the next phase of economic evolution. And I think that's incredibly encouraging. I think the multilateral system has suffered from over-inclusiveness by trying to accommodate non-market economies that are adopting a mercantilist approach to trade and are more interested in the national power projection than they are in the economic welfare that is to be had from it. And so I think we're looking at re-globalization rather than deglobalization. And it doesn't have to involve a huge amount of onshoring. I think there's plenty of scope for specialization, but we need to make sure that adjustment mechanisms are working so that the macroeconomic fallout that we've seen from the global financial crisis onwards can be avoided. That's my sense.
Any others would like to add to that thought process there? Any thoughts? Quick.
Okay, so from my side, two quick comments. In terms of the policy measures and so on, I see three directions or frameworks, let's say it: free trade, protected trade, and then managed trade. I'm a free trade advocate, but I do agree with some of my colleagues in the area that some of these policies, they should not put everything in the same basket, general, but be more focused on trade, services, and goods that really represent a risk. So any policy intervention should be to a specific export product, export country, and not everything in general. Otherwise, I mean, indeed, we're talking about the globalization. And in that aspect, I also have some views. I agree, actually, that we do have indeed a crisis in multilateralism, but I'm not so convinced with the globalization and then with all the reshoring noise. In fact, I don't really think this is happening, and this I have been seeing at least 4 out of 5 different surveys, being the last one even last month, a CEO survey, and I think was not mistaken, Conference Board, where the CEO is saying they are not really considering reshoring at all. They might be looking indeed into diversification, but they're not in the back of their minds to reshare back home. Or then they will do some specialization, as mentioned by Stuart and so on, and really focus on diversification. So I think we also need to be careful about there with all this criticism and trade, globalization. I think I agree with Steve, with Stuart. I think that what is happening is evolving, is changing, but it's just in a different way. It has been some slowness and goods, but it's not only goods. I mean, we have different flows that need the parameters to look at globalization. And then look at digital trade is booming. I mean, look at the flow of people. They're all back now traveling as well. And this is all part of globalization. So I would just say, let's be careful with this whole wave and noise that is happening out there. Thank you, Alice. Back to you.
That's great. We've really run out of time. Unless there's an urgent last minute comment we would like to throw in, I think we should start to close. But I think you've all provided great food for thought for not only business leaders, but also policymakers in terms of how they think about how to approach globalization, trade barriers, and the current efforts to reshore their supply chains. So thank you for this informative session. I would like to give special thanks to our panelists, Myra, Daria, Fernanda, and Stuart, for sharing with us today these great insights. And many thanks as well to our audience for joining us.